The Gold Coast, now known as Ghana, was a significant center of the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to the 19th century. This period was marked by the forced migration of millions of Africans, including many from the Gold Coast, to the Americas and Europe. The impact of the slave trade on the Gold Coast was profound and multifaceted, affecting its social, economic, and political structures. The Gold Coast was rich in natural resources, particularly gold, which attracted European traders as early as the 15th century. However, the demand for labor in the New World plantations shifted the focus from gold to human beings. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to engage in the slave trade in the region, followed by the Dutch, British, Danes, and others. Forts and castles such as Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle were established along the coast to facilitate the capture, storage, and shipment of enslaved Africans. The slave trade had a dual economic impact on the Gold Coast. On one hand, it introduced new goods and wealth into the region through trade with Europeans. African intermediaries and local leaders who collaborated with European traders gained access to firearms, textiles, alcohol, and other goods in exchange for slaves. This trade created a class of wealthy and powerful elites who benefited from the commerce. On the other hand, the long-term economic consequences were devastating. The removal of millions of people, many of whom were young and able-bodied, severely depleted the labor force. This loss hampered agricultural production and other forms of economic activity, leading to a decline in overall productivity. The focus on capturing and trading slaves also diverted resources and attention away from other economic activities, stunting the development of diverse and sustainable economies. The social fabric of the Gold Coast was profoundly disrupted by the slave trade. Communities were torn apart as individuals were captured and sold, often by neighboring tribes or even within their own communities. This created an environment of fear and mistrust, eroding traditional social structures and kinship bonds. The demographic impact was also significant. The loss of a large portion of the population, particularly young men and women, led to imbalanced gender ratios and affected marriage patterns and family structures. The constant threat of raids and kidnappings contributed to social instability and insecurity. The political landscape of the Gold Coast was dramatically altered by the slave trade. The influx of European goods, especially firearms, led to an arms race among local polities. Those who controlled the slave trade routes and had access to European weapons gained significant power and influence. This often resulted in the rise of militarized states and the decline of others, reshaping the political map of the region. The Ashanti Empire, for instance, became one of the dominant powers in the region, in part due to its involvement in the slave trade and its access to European arms. However, this also led to increased conflicts and wars, as states vied for control of trade routes and territories. The constant warfare further destabilized the region and compounded the suffering of its people. Culturally, the slave trade had a lasting impact on the Gold Coast. The interaction with European traders and the introduction of foreign goods and ideas influenced local cultures and traditions. However, the forced migration also meant the loss of cultural continuity for many communities, as people were uprooted from their ancestral lands and traditions. Religious practices were also affected. While traditional African religions remained strong, the presence of European traders brought Christianity to the region. Over time, Christian missions established during and after the slave trade period would play a significant role in the cultural and religious transformation of the Gold Coast. The legacy of the slave trade in the Gold Coast is still felt today. The trauma and disruption caused by the transatlantic slave trade left deep psychological scars and a legacy of mistrust and division. The economic underdevelopment and social disruptions initiated during the slave trade era have had lasting effects, contributing to challenges in post-colonial development and nation-building. Efforts to address this legacy include the preservation of historical sites, such as the castles and forts, which now serve as important reminders of the region's history and as sites of memory and education. Ghana's role in the slave trade is also acknowledged in its national consciousness, and the country has become a focal point for the African diaspora seeking to reconnect with their heritage.